Francois was far beyond many of her contemporaries.
And I would even go so far as to say that she was more progressive than Butler, Cipriani, and Rienzi put together. She grew up in a time of empire, yet at the same time she didn't see herself as a child or part of the British Empire. We are here today in Cipriani College, and that name itself is representative of what we are trying to achieve. So how do we make the education system more relevant, more inclusive in a wider context of wider social inequalities? So the very foundations of our society has been built upon some of the greatest crimes against humanity. So how do we engineer institutions and debates and put forward the necessary ideas to repair from the social, internal, and even the mental drama or trauma that has come as a result of those issues? At Cipriani College, we have a range of programs suited at the ordinary working class to not only engage them in terms of their specific disciplines, but also for us to learn collectively about our society, about our history, and the realities of the Caribbean region. So this is an attempt to craft an education system that is relevant to ordinary people. The topic today is Venezuela. And Venezuela is a country that is close to my heart. And I remember in 2009, there was a summit of the Americas. And then Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez presented a book to US President Barack Obama. And the title of the book was The Open Veins of Latin America, 5 Centuries of Pillage of a Continent. And that book is so very important in us understanding the legacies of colonialism and imperialism and how it has affected the state of Venezuela. So since our so-called independence, Caribbean leaders and leaders of the wider Latin America space never really had the freedom to chart their own legacy and pathway of development without intervention from foreign powers. So today in our panel, we are here to discuss and dialogue some of these finer issues surrounding Venezuela. And it is especially configured to ensure that it's not only a monologue, but there will be chance for the audience to participate. So again, a warm Cipriani welcome to everyone. Thank you. And now I turn you over to Dr. Andre Henry, our director and our moderator for the evening.
Thanks, Tahimba. And I just want to add my welcome to Tahimba. I'm very pleased to have all of you in this space. I want to congratulate my colleagues under the astute leadership of Mr. Atkins Vidal. You could stand? All right, that's Atkins at the bottom here. The coordinator of the Elma Francois Institute for bringing this occasion together. Since the launch of the Institute last year, we've been very busy and we've touched on a range of issues that are of concern to working people in the country. And I need to emphasize, as Tahimba did with a lot more youthful vigor than I have, that we have a bias at the college for working people. The events in Venezuela are indicative of the smallness of our world and the interdependence of people. For us in Trinidad and Tobago, because of our physical proximity, there is a special urgency for us to understand these events in real time as they unfold, and not understanding them just because of their immediate and visible impact. We need a perspective that adequately frames the events in Venezuela in a manner that makes us aware of the thinking environment and the thinking challenge that we face as a small country. Part of my own disappointment in the way that the issue has been discussed in Trinidad and Tobago, or at least the way it is ventilated in the press, is that the perspectives continue to be very narrow and opportunistic. In the short time we have this evening, we can't explore all of the ramifications that we at the college hope. What we at the college hope to do, therefore, is to air some interconnectedness and even some contested perspectives that could promote a more meaningful discussion in the national community. I believe it's important to talk about the immediate because there are immediate considerations for our own national stability, and there are immediate humanitarian considerations with respect to the people of Venezuela. At the same time, there has to be vigorous debate about some of the longer-term integrity issues about our democracies in the Caribbean and beyond. Accordingly, in our haste to win political points, we cannot ignore the potential longer-term implications of the statements we make and the actions that we take in the moment. For us at the college, we want to get the widest perspective on the potential effects of the immediate situation on working people in Trinidad and Tobago, but we also want to understand how what is taking place fits into the current flow of history and what it means for defining the organization of society in the age of Trump, rising right-wing nationalism, as well as a resurgent Russia and an emergent China. In the age of globalization, the smallness of our world and our own smallness should not escape us. Accordingly, we are starting this discussion this evening, exploring some general perspectives, and in the coming months, we will drill down on some themes that we believe are more specific to our mandate here at Cipriani. I'm very pleased at the panel that we've been able to put together, and I would just like to briefly introduce who they are. Reagan Devines, is joining us from Turkey via Skype. Reagan is a Trinbagonian broadcast journalist who lives in Istanbul. He previously lived in Caracas, where he reported during the 1917 deadly protests for the station Telesur. 2017, sorry. It's been a long day. Liana Ganga is an MSc Sociology student in the Department of Behavioral Science at the University of the West Indies. Her current research focuses on debates around power, the colonial thought, and development discourses. I guess you know who Liana is among our panel. Aman Hotep is a former radio talk show host of the show Dialogue. He's one of the founders and administrators of the alternative media website trinicenter.com. Trinicenter has been covering the Venezuelan situation for many years and was one of the few media outlets who gave accurate on-the-ground reporting during the 2002 attempted coup in Venezuela. Mariano Brown is currently managing partner of Mariano Brown and Company, which provides financial and management advisory services, and is the executive chairman of Elida Management Services Limited. He's a former member of the cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago, in which he held two portfolios simultaneously, the Minister of Trade and Industry and the Minister in the Ministry of Finance. Prior to his appointment as minister, he spent most of his time in the financial sector in the region. Immediately before assuming office, he was managing director of Butterfield Bank for 4 years and CEO of Caribbean Commercial Bank Limited for 11 years. He has held senior management positions in Republic Bank and was a founding principal of an investment bank in Trinidad and Tobago. Mariano writes regularly on matters of banking and finance in the region and presented several papers at international conferences. How come they didn't say he talks about politics? He also hosts a radio program, the I-95 Mandate, which deals with issues of development. For many years, Mariano traveled on a Venezuelan passport. How many 125 cousins? About 125 cousins in Venezuela. My dear friend Terence Walker is an experienced career diplomat and foreign service professional. He represented Trinidad and Tobago for more than 3 decades. Terry served in Washington, D.C., New York, Lagos, Nigeria, and London. He has negotiated extensively on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, including countries in Latin America. So we have, Terry's father was also a Venezuelan national, and he has some siblings, half brothers and half sisters in Venezuela. We'll organize this session as follows. I will ask each of the panelists to make an introductory statement, not longer than 7 minutes. Then we will take another round around the panel with each panelist in the event that they would like to respond to anything specific that was said by their fellow panelists. And we would limit that round to 3 minutes. And we will then open up for questions and comments from the audience. What we will do is we would limit interventions from the audience to 2 minutes each, so that we can have as many people contribute and participate as possible. And rather than have panelists respond to each individual intervention, we will try to take clusters of interventions and get reactions from the panel. We will then have a closing round of comments from the panel. Should we start with Reagan? So we will start with Reagan, and then we will start from furthest left. So we'll go Amon, Terry, Liana, and Mariano.
Good evening, having just give a practice of what's happening in Venezuela. Arrived in Venezuela in 2015. This was just before the election, on control of the National Assembly. For the first time, we wanted control of the first government power. Now, when the opposition won the National Assembly, there was some among their lands because others had votes to them, the country ready for a new government. But they moved forward and they won the National Assembly and investigates irregularity and to a few states the occupant part. The university by swearing in lawmakers from the states that were under investigation, and when they did that, the Supreme Court ruled that whatever the National Assembly ruled would not hold. You know what? It wouldn't hold that hold into law. But that Supreme Court and tried to assume the National Assembly's responsibilities. That was a movie President Maduro, that was a irony. And that, along with the deep deteriorating country, led to every protest the year when the President died. Now the opposition out there, was protested in the hundreds of thousands, and you get to see pictures. And whenever there was opposition protests, the government's supporters have come to the demonstration, and once they were put on the street, the army was present on those days. I'm sure you saw pictures of army shooting protesters, but according to the government, it was to prevent the opposition supporters, many of them identified far things to prevent them from clashing with government supporters. Because in the past, we've seen that when the opposition supporters meet, nothing good comes good, and there's a loss of life. The army was also there to prevent damage to public and private property. I've seen both hands during protest. So, of course, Venezuela's major problems and so on. I don't think that they people that, which part of which the isn't. If they restricted country of food like some materials, and that's of course that restrictions that really about the shortages of the sword. And inflation is still rising out of control. The UN agency says that by the end of this year it should be at 1 million %. And of course, I believe the minimum wage in Venezuela is about 18,000 people at the current exchange rate. That's about, I think, $50 a month. Now, even if the government has mitigated the harm, they have tried to get social programs as they can, is by the poorest the boxes of food under the program called PAPS. But recent support suggests that that's been reduced. That is the problem. Get worse. You want about 1,000 people letting up here. Ecuador, the US, the Caribbean, past few years. Many of its allies are now recognizing opposition leader and national president as the interim president until coming forward. Juan Guaido he is new to many Venezuelans, but he is a face and he has somehow managed to re-energize the opposition base. Many of whom have left Venezuela, hold up in embassies across the region because they, according to them, they are currently accidentally taken to custody by the government. And many others, and a few others, still not running for politics. And so what Guaido presents really hope for the opposition that somehow things can change and Venezuela party in So as well, there's a lot of controversy around recent investigative report that came out stating what Guaido was pretty much grew as a student in universities, American universities, to eventually part of a program to have the government change the power structure. I want to show how credible important it is if you concentrate on Venezuela with the opposition to those governments. But there is a standard right now at Venezuela where the US is supposedly sending a lot of aid Saturday, tomorrow, Thursday. There's aid there at court, still waiting to be let into the country, but the has the ban on any international aid, says he does not travel. Obviously from the US allies because he's there somehow. This aid will contain supply to arm the opposition. This is not to be uncredible because the US is, the US has a history of using humanitarian aid to undermine governments that we think should not be in power. And so it's very, very complicated right now. Although I've been there for just about a year now, my aim is on the ground there, and so it has not begun again since Drew named himself the heading he's the president. He's given a lot of support. This humanitarian aid is a big issue that people address. I'm sure it's hard to not set this aid that is being Hungary. Many parents have had to sell whatever they have to fork up $200 so that they can set their kids somewhere out of the way just so that they could have a future. Could be their kids will get a job, make themselves a success, and help their place they have found. That is the hope when people send their child abroad. What is going to happen with this humanitarian aid? We have no idea now. What it knows. We heard US President Donald Trump say that military intervention is not all political. It's an interesting way of putting it. I'm sure it is just going to strike something that is not. It is not really political, it has very popularities in Russia and China. And of course, Russia has proven that it's going to take that Europe and lending him military support as well.
Good evening, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, hosts, Tamba Salandi. First thing, y'all would have probably noticed that I was fidgeting during the national anthem. And that is probably because I'm trying to be courteous to those who invited me here, to try to stand for it. But I'm no fan of the national anthem. This country was never forged from the love of liberty, and every creed and race does not find an equal place in Trinidad and Tobago. And when that is well understood, we will tend to have an idea of the forces at play in Venezuela, right? So we like to say all these nice things, but you know, there have never been spaces in this country, in the media, from since independence to now, that really respected having discussions about race, history, and what it means to be a Trinidadian, what it means to be an African who first came over as slaves, or from one of the smaller islands, again from slavery, and then you are into a country where there are forces now pulling at you all how. So we maintain somewhat of a plantation economy and mentality, where certain sections of non-white people are destined to be at the bottom of the social and economic ladder, and there's very little respect paid to the voices of ordinary people. It's these concerns that led me on a campaign to try to get our local media, and especially so our state media, to open up spaces for this type of dialogue. And if we were doing that, we would have been better equipped to understand what is taking place in Venezuela, which is partly attributable to a class struggle and a race struggle. You know, and you can't leave out the race because people hate to discuss the effects of racism. But a large percentage of Venezuelans don't see themselves as white. They see themselves as black, and some more other indigenous groups like the mestizos. And they have never felt themselves in control of their society, the economy, and they have generally been marginalized. I mean, when I started traveling to Venezuela in the 80s, the things that bothered me the most was around every town. You would see all these poor structures that around the whole mountains. And what was taking place in the country? Why the middle class fell out in the 80s due to the recession, similar to what happened in Trinidad. And the people who suffered the most during those times were the people who were considered non-white. So it is no surprise that even in Venezuela media, largely controlled by the white elites, you find very derogatory labels placed on non-whites. And it's very open. I mean, in a society that is so polarized today, you have media that is calling for the assassination of the president and using terms like monkey and the sort to describe him. And if the government was to react, then they claim freedom of the press is being infringed, and then we have all this outcry. So unless people are willing to wipe their feet at the door in terms of understanding racism and how it impacts the dialogue and creates the level of distrust that exists in these societies, we wouldn't be able to understand why they can't have a dialogue today to resolve the issues. The dialogue is very strained because it's not just the upper class and the lower class that need to engage in dialogue towards resolving the issues, but they also need to have major countries leaving people alone to work out the stories and not continually interfering because you want to get your hand around the resources of the country. And this is it's not like if we don't know this. Anybody who is a student should have known that the Americans have a long history of interference in the politics of other countries, and should be laughing at the issues they have with the claim about Russian interference in their politics. So the only people who should be allowed to interfere in the affairs of other countries should be Americans, which makes absolutely no sense, right? And this puts Trinidad in a very precarious position, given that traditionally we claim to be allies of the US. It means without questioning what America has been doing globally, we simply stay quiet and then say we are allies. So it means we are inadvertently complicit in a lot of what is taking place globally and the disenfranchisement and murder of people globally. Sorry that Trinidadians don't get to see the numerous perspectives I get to see as an editor of a website that aggregates news from around the world. And I make a lot of effort to share it on call-in programs because I know far too often people are busy. They don't have the time to spend 6 hours researching. So they listen to what comes over the CNN, the mainstream media, the Reuters, the Associated Press, not knowing that a lot of what is coming to you is loaded. It is loaded to favor a type of capitalism that is brutal on the underclass. Very, very brutal. So it is with this backdrop I admired when Hugo Chavez came to power and decided he wanted to shift the paradigm, to put the focus more on ordinary people. His emphasis was on respect for women, respect for indigenous groups, bringing healthcare services to them, building, from what I've read in the reports, roughly 2 million homes in 7 years for low-income earners, something that Trinidad can't seem to do properly, And a lot of this was funded from oil, the oil money. So they put the oil money to work mostly for ordinary people. He also nationalized a lot of their key oil and mineral industries, much to the disgust of many multi-corporations. And here is where I think is at the crux of the conflict between Venezuela and the US, with a lot of these corporations wanting the energy sector privatized. I agree with Chavez that for something so essential to your country, the state needs to have a type of control. The problem is, as Alfred de Zea, and his name will come up later on, rightly said, he thinks the Savage group have too much ideologies and very little technocrats. And that is understandable because you're not going to get fair cooperation from the people with the political know-how of how to navigate these spaces. You have to create it. But if you're loaded with biases, then every error that is made from the underclass is judged extremely harsh. So it's not like if corruption is just something that you will see in the sphere of this new socialist regime. Corruption has been endemic in the society from ever since. But they speak about it in a way as if ordinary people cannot manage their affairs, where it is they are not allowing ordinary people the space to develop their own systems and politics. So they sabotage it, and then at the end of the day, come back and say, well, they failed, they can't do it. So there are two forces at play when we look at Venezuela. You have the internal elites who are not going to surrender power easily, and they're willing to sabotage the economy to do it with strategic shortages. And then you have the US, who has been collaborating with the elites in Venezuela to ensure that this socialist revolution failed. As a matter of fact, they don't even want the dialogue that they were having in 2017, even from 15 to 17, that was supported by Santo Domingo, the Vatican, and others to succeed. After they agreed, they decided to pull out and not sign, and all but that they asked for and the concessions that were made, they walk away from. Ladies, this is my 7 minutes, and I hope that this discussion develops. I get to share a little more about other perspectives that I have been collecting about what is taking place in Venezuela today. Thank you.
I want to say, first of all, that I'm speaking as Citizen Terry Walker, and I don't represent anybody, any political parties, Mariano, this evening. And I want to, if we were to have a sub-theme of the presentation this evening, my piece would be understanding Trinidad and Tobago's foreign policy, because this is my point, this is my expertise, I guess, and this is my point of departure. I want to say that foreign policy refers to a country's strategy in dealing with other countries, and it consists of self-interest strategies, and those strategies are chosen by the government. Our brother would take the perspective that elites determine strategy, and in that case, if we were to have read a book published recently by Selwyn Kojo, the slave master of Trinidad, even during slavery we had foreign policy, even though the foreign policy at that time, and in fact, Selwyn says that Burnley, who is the main character in the book, the slave master, was the first prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago. So that foreign policy during slavery reflected the views of the slave masters, his interests. And foreign policy differs from diplomacy. Foreign policy are the principles, diplomacy is more the practice, and it's a spectrum of actions that the state employs for conducting its relations with foreign countries. And it could involve, it's transactional, so it evolves. And it's also a principled method of dealing with things. And it's intuitive in that sense. And it would involve policies, perspectives, messages, concerns, protests, and by its very nature, and this is what a lot of people don't understand when they talk about, when they criticize the current government's policy, it's predictable, it's formal, it takes place in an environment in which both sides know where they're coming from, so that the discussion takes place in that context, and you could have a successful outcome because you've already agreed on the terms of reference. So when you listen to public comment, listen to comment in radio shows, I don't think people realize that it's an exact science. It's not something for amateurs. It's not something for, I used to be an opening batsman, and I never scored many runs, but I batted a long time. So, but I was a professional. I would open the innings and close the innings because they couldn't get me out, but I didn't score many runs. But I held it together. So I'm saying that you need different players for different wickets, and diplomacy and foreign policy is not something for amateurs. That's the first main point I want to make. And I want to talk a little bit about Trinidad and Tobago's policy in a general sense. It's not something that came out of a vacuum. It's not something that we make up. It's something that's honed by our history, by our culture, by our many ethnicities, brother. You know, we can't talk about Africans in Trinidad and Tobago without talking about the slave masters people, without talking about Indians, without talking about Chinese. Our foreign policy is the way it is because we're a multi-ethnic country. It's also honed because of our geography. We're not going to move Trinidad and Tobago and put it up in the north of the Caribbean. It's our policy towards Venezuela has been honed over hundreds of years, and it's as a result, the way it is now is as a result of the proximity. We're right next door, so of course it's going to have an influence. And it's not something that we can change opportunistically. We cannot change like a certain leader of the opposition, certain members of parliament from Naparima and Princestown. We can't just change it. We've made it over hundreds of years. 1 minute already. I told you I bat long. So, as a sovereign, so the policy is honed in the colonial period as a colony and as a sovereign nation now. A few snapshots about the relationship with Venezuela. It's not been a static one, but my experience as a diplomat tells me that it's not always been pleasant. It's been volatile, sometimes cozy, mostly volatile, sometimes adversarial, but always unequal. It's an unequal relationship. One snapshot, the threat to the Caribbean. Anybody too young to remember, except the gray-haired ones amongst us? That's a speech Eric Williams made in 1975. And it's a brilliant, incisive, you need to read it. You need to read it if you haven't read it. The threat to the Caribbean. It's a brilliant, incisive analysis of Trinidad, Caribbean, Venezuela relations. And it remains relevant and poignant even today. And you will get from that an understanding of where we are today as far in respect of the cross-border gas issues, and more currently in respect of Guyana, Venezuela issues. Makuro, second theme. Interestingly, in that book, Forge of the Love of Liberty, that piece on Venezuela, or shall we say Caribbean and Venezuela, is in a chapter entitled Recolonization. Think about that. Think about that and think about Trinidad and Tobago's relationship with Venezuela. Makuro, which is a little place on the tip of Venezuela, 20 miles from Chagaramas. We went there, a gentleman sitting in the audience and myself, with Ralph Maraj. And we met with the then Venezuela Foreign Minister, Burudi Rivas, and we put together an agenda for cooperation, including energy, education, transportation, culture, massive. We spoke about daily ferries, about Trinidad cars driving in Venezuela and vice versa. Following that, quickly, fisherman shot within spitting distance from the beach in Chatham. Meet with Venezuela. A whole week. To this day, they've never recognized where they were. That was an attack on our sovereign territory, the first one I know of. That's the kind of relationship I'm talking about. Similar incidents, not violent, not as violent as that one. Ralph Marage's speech at the OAS General Assembly in his normal, full thespian, Oscar tour de force way, he spoke about Venezuela, about Trinidad and Tobago under the armpits of Venezuela. The result of that, withdrawal of the ambassador from Port of Spain. High points and low points. Just as the chairman is prompting me to leave the podium, with regard to Venezuela, and regard to non-intervention in particular, non-intervention, non-interference, non-use of force in international affairs. These three principles really won, since non-intervention is predicated on the other two. Even as a fledgling nation, Trinidad and Tobago, armed with these principles, first Commonwealth country to join the OAS. With those principles in our back pocket. They've remained in our back pocket following several decades. They remained in our back pocket when we recognized China ahead of most of the countries in the Caribbean, when we recognized Cuba, when we singly, almost unilaterally, I was at the OAS, and we opposed the intervention in Grenada. To issue the principles now would not help Venezuela, and most importantly, will destroy what we are, an independent country that guards our sovereignty, swimming in these sharks, with these sharks in these waters. Thank you very much. Didn't bat long enough.
Good evening to my fellow panelists and members of the audience. They are contesting narratives about the current crisis in Venezuela, as Venezuela is currently facing severe economic contraction caused by a variety of factors, including collapsing oil prices, crippling US-led sanctions, as well as corruption and economic mismanagement. There's a popular narrative disseminated by Western media houses of Maduro the socialist dictator and of socialism turning Venezuela into a hellhole. However, what is absent from this narrative is the role of the US in creating this crisis via its foreign policy, inclusive of sanctions and the guise of humanitarian aid, coupled with deliberately misleading propaganda. To gain a better understanding of this current crisis, I would first point out examples of intervention by the US in the region and then give some details on the current crisis. Since the election of Chavez in 1998, Venezuela has been a geopolitical enemy of the US and the UK. Chavez renationalized the oil industry, revived the OPEC cartel, criticized the US invasion of Afghanistan, and embraced the ideology of 21st century socialism. This falls within the pattern of US involvement in the region. For the English-speaking Caribbean, some examples include Guyana, that was placed under pressure from Britain and the US during the 1950s to 1964. In this case, colonial and imperial powers wanted to maintain control over the country's mineral wealth, coupled with Cold War anxieties. Britain and the US went to great lengths to prevent the democratically elected leader from occupying office, Dr. Cheddi Jagan, and the PPP, who were elected by a majority. Suspicions of his socialist tendencies led to the suspension of the Constitution and his removal. In 1957, Jagan won elections again, and this time the imperial powers used more subtle ways to have him removed. The CIA fortified his political opponents and funded anti-communist groups, but despite these efforts, he was re-elected in 1961. He went to Washington asking for aid, but the Kennedy administration needed to determine where he fell on the political spectrum before granting any aid. Here we see the politicizing of aid, which is also used in this current crisis, though a bit differently. At the end of that visit, they classified Jagan a Marxist, and no economic aid was given, and the country's independence was delayed. In 1962, the CIA helped to organize and finance anti-Jagan protests, resulting in strikes and arson and intensifying racial conflict from which Guyana has not fully recovered. The US placed a general embargo, which led Jagan to turn to Cuba and the Soviet bloc. Another example is of Jamaica's democratic socialist experiment during the 1970s. Here again, Washington politicized aid. Manley became an enemy of the US for expressing support for the regime in Angola that the US was trying to topple, establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba and the Soviet Union, advocating democratic socialism, and plans to buy out 51% of the foreign bauxite mining operations, and encouraging other bauxite mining third world nations to do the same. Based on these decisions, he was denied aid, and operations to destabilize Jamaica began. In the election year of 1976, there were reports of a destabilization program by the CIA, including covert shipments of arms and other equipment to opposition forces. This publicized violence hit Jamaica's tourism industry, which led to worsening social, political, and economic conditions. Manley was defeated at elections in 1980 due to the continuing deterioration of the standard of living, but Manley stated that defeat was due to propaganda and finely calculated violence. There is also the experience of Grenada, and similar tactics have been used throughout Latin America and the Middle East. Currently, there's a war being waged in Venezuela, and propaganda is also being used. The media has been just as important as the military in this war in Venezuela. A study done by sociologist Alan MacLeod, interviewing journalists and academics in Venezuela and analyzing the media coverage on Venezuela from 1998 to 2017, had the following findings. Since the election of Chavez in 1998, the US has played a highly questionable role of interfering in Venezuelan politics, funding, training, and supporting attempts at coups to remove the democratically elected president. Yet the American media have presented the US as overwhelmingly positively, despite the wealth of evidence that contradicted this. The concept of democracy in the media was automatically applied to whatever the US policy was at the time. Major newspapers in the UK and the US reproduced the ideology of Western governments, ignoring strong empirical evidence challenging those positions. The press portrayed Venezuela in an overwhelmingly negative light, presenting highly contested minority opinions as facts while barely mentioning competing arguments. He used the concept of manufacturing consent, and he pointed out the role of the media that legitimized elections in friendly countries and delegitimized those in enemy states without regard to the empirical facts on the ground. He argued that the model's theory of legitimizing and delegitimizing foreign elections still holds, and the case of Venezuela and Colombia proves this. Elections in Venezuela, an enemy of the US government, were presented as a sham. The media ignored glowing reports from the international observation missions, but in contrast, US ally Colombia was presented as a vibrant democracy, with the media glossing over or simply not reporting the numerous and widespread problems. Oh, sorry. The widespread problems and downplaying violence and terror. The mainstream media also does not include the views of citizens against the US intervention and aggression, and those who want a peaceful solution to their crisis. They also ignore the voices of Chavistas that value sovereignty and the view that the crisis was caused by US blockades and sanctions.
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words I hope you will invite me again after I'm finished. As intimated by Andre at the beginning, I come from a mixed family. My maternal grandmother would be white, and she made the very difficult decision of getting a divorce somewhere in the 1920s. And she came from a fairly good family in Venezuela. And she did the unthinkable. She got married to a black man. So she was ostracized. He had business interests between here and Venezuela, and he died in Trinidad. My grandmother brought the family to Trinidad essentially to see his grave. She sent one of the two boys in advance and to set up shop, more or less to get a feel for the country. Brought over everybody. There were 8 children. And she went back to Venezuela to settle her estates, and she died. So they were orphaned in Trinidad. They grew up in Trinidad. So I understand some of the difficulties which Amon Hotep spoke about with regard to class and difficulties. I understand a lot more about Venezuela from the point of view that it's a country, in the sense that fought an early war of independence, 1805, facilitated by the British, became independent and part of a greater conglomeration, which was meant to be something like the United States, and consisted of what is now known as Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. Those of you who speak Spanish and or read Spanish books would know Gabriel Marquez and En General en su Laberinto, which chronicles that development. Democracies of recent vintage in Venezuela, 1958 or thereabouts, and largely associated with oil. And if you want North American intervention from that perspective, and the multinationals that set up shop. And its growth and development as an oil-rich country has been largely as a result of that as well. So that we have a couple of developments taking place. Some positive, if you will, and now we hear about the negatives in terms of Venezuela, about the capitalism's development. Those of you who are familiar again with Latin American literature would understand Andre Frank, who, although he went to a very good capitalist school called the University of Chicago, and his thesis moderator was Milton Friedman, nonetheless wrote a book about capitalism and the development in Latin America, which more or less is a definitive standard if you want to understand anything about Latin America. Having said that, and understanding the difficulties, I want to say that the difficulties in Venezuela have nothing to do with isms, socialism, capitalism, or otherwise. And one of the things that we also need to remember is that all of these guiding lights and different large countries have all been imperialist powers at some stage of the game. China, Russia, Britain, America. And that at every stage of the game, we have always had some form of elite. Right? And in the case of Russia within recent vintage, we've watched the breakup of Russia and essentially the development of a whole series of elites who have fled Russia and left Russia, in a sense, impoverished and with great sense of difficulty. And guess where the money went to? The money went to the West. We know them as Abramovich, he owns Chelsea Football Club, and a number of other, if you want, isms and different people who are around. And quite frankly, the West has accepted them and accepted their money just as well. And the bottom line in all of that is money knows no politics. That's a fundamental lesson that has to be learned. And the person who said that was the head of Citibank when he retired, the man who was more or less responsible for putting Citibank on the world map. And it's a lesson that I have never forgotten. Money knows no politics. So I am not in any way captured by capitalism and or socialism as one being better than the other. If we look at the recent developments in China, we'll see a series of elites who have grown up as part of the revolution and who can now control the Communist Party in large measure. Right? Xi Jinping is the son of part of that elite. Well respected, well trained, and everything else that goes with that. The difficulties that have taken place in Venezuela are a result of economic failures. Economic failures. Of course there were elites, of course there was money that was siphoned off. Like everywhere else, there's always conflict within societies about who gets wealth and who does what. And there's ample evidence of that in Venezuela as well. The reality is that Chavez, whilst he may have been a populist leader, followed a series of populist policies which pauperized and essentially brought Venezuela to its knees. Whether you like it or not, whether you want to talk about American intervention and American positions or otherwise, that is the reality. And the reality is that we're talking about a society which is imploding. Whether we want to call Maduro a dictator or otherwise, he certainly does not have the same level of popular support as Chavez did. Chavez didn't need to have or manufacture an election. He would have won, and if he were alive, he would have won again, notwithstanding the weaknesses in economic policies. What is happening in Venezuela is that we're looking at an implosion as a result of poor economic policies, which in a sense have contraindicators. And one of the lessons that we have to learn ourselves, because within recent vintage we have two political parties that are following a particular populist line themselves. And notwithstanding the substantial increase in our wealth between 1999 and say 2014, the argument will have to be, notwithstanding the amount of money that's spent, are we better off? And that has nothing to do with socialism, capitalism, or otherwise. It has to do with how we sculpture and craft economic policies to help the society move forward. And one of the fundamental lessons that we have to have learned is that giving people money does not necessarily make them productive and doesn't carry them out of the economic trap in which we find themselves. When we correct for all the other issues in terms of access to finance, capital, and otherwise, the reality is that some people move their way up, and they do so by following some fiscal disciplines, tight management. And the fundamental unit of economic policy remains the family. Some cultures in Trinidad understand that. In the East Indian community, in the black community, yes, I have it too. Stopwatch, not notes. In the East Indian community, in the Syrian community, and we develop labels for them. We call them the elite, we call them 1%. The reality is that they have learned, some of those families have learned certain issues. What will happen in 2 generations or 3 generations from now? Will they be as rich? Well, the Penny families were millionaires in 1759 as a result of Nevis sugar. The Pennies are not rich and wealthy today in England. It took time. And what happens by the 4th or 5th generation, they're losing money. So that the reality is that we have to talk about how do we create a just and equitable society which allows for all of us to have opportunities, but also to understand that we need to learn some basic truths and some basic values which will keep us strong and which in a sense will allow us to continue to grow. That is some of the difficulties that is taking place in Venezuela as we speak, and it has nothing to do with socialism. It just has to do with poor planning and poor management. Thank you.